Welcome to this LexisNexis Risk Solutions webinar, Balancing Resources and Risks in Anti-Bribery and Corruption Efforts. I'm Mary Windishar, and before we begin, here are a few brief announcements. This webinar is being recorded, and an on-demand link will be sent to all attendees after the webinar, along with the presentation deck. Today's event will be interactive, so please disable any pop-up blockers you may have installed. They can interfere with certain aspects of our web conference. For an enhanced view of our presentation, click the Enlarge Slides button located in the gray bar above the slide window. You may ask a question at any time. To submit yours, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen and type it into the question box area that appears, and then hit the Submit button. Today, Charles Thomas of LexisNexis Risk Solutions is our featured speaker. Mr. Thomas is a subject matter expert within the anti-bribery and corruption market, or ABC market. With over 10 years of global experience, he provides a detailed view of the pressures and problems that the ever-increasing enforcement and regulation of ABC poses to companies in all sectors. Charles Thomas is a frequent speaker at a wide range of events globally, covering a range of anti-corruption, risk management, and due diligence topics, including the UK Bribery Act, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and more. Welcome, and over to you, Mr. Thomas.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Marion. Thank you all for taking the time to dial in and listen wherever you are around the world. I wanted to take some time today to cover really looking at what is a growing tide as well as an overlapping tide of both enforcement and regulation within the anti-bribery and corruption world, and how some other regulatory regimes are now bleeding into that to create an ever more challenging scenario for compliance professionals. And by way of beginning, I wanted to start with some of the costs of non-compliance, the problems of getting it wrong. And some of these are very obvious. There are the big fines handed down, but some of them are a little bit different. And one that came to mind on a recent speaking engagement was a hydroelectric project that's being constructed in Australia at the moment, which is being heavily championed by the Prime Minister, a man called Malcolm Turnbull. One of the contractors on this contract is currently under investigation for bribery. So it's not actually Malcolm Turnbull himself who is under investigation for bribery, but a contractor on a project that he is championing. However, the press, in their infinite wisdom, will always look to bring down the tall poppy. They will always look to find the person at the top of the tree to make them the example. So in all the current press coverage of the Snowy Hydro project, it's never the consultant who is under investigation or the consultant who is in the limelight. It's always the Prime Minister himself. So it has a real knock-on effect on his reputation, even though actually it's nothing to do with him personally. Another current trend we're seeing in anti-bribery and corruption enforcement is personal enforcement. I recently attended a conference where an individual from the FBI's financial crime unit stood in front of an audience and with a very menacing yet friendly smile said, "I'm a people person. I like prosecuting people." And there's a very definite move towards prosecuting individuals as well as the companies. And in some cases, there's a move or an appetite to actually prosecute the individuals harder than the companies themselves. This recent case here was from the UK Bribery Act, where a juror was jailed for taking a bribe in a drugs trial. So taking a bribe to perhaps try and sway the decision in a jury. We're also seeing knock-on effects from some of the existing fines. There is an ongoing case with Odebrecht in Latin America, part of the Lava Jato compliance cleanup, as it were. And as a result of what's happened in Brazil with Odebrecht, where they've had huge bribery and corruption issues and there have been very big fines handed down, other countries are now actually starting to take notice. Mexico have taken the stand that they as a government will not contract with Odebrecht for quite a long period of time in business, 2.5 years. Now, when you consider that Odebrecht are in the construction space and with the Mexican economy being fairly strong, there's a lot of construction work they could be bidding for and they could be involved with. That's a really a bad impact on your business to have. So the fine itself is one thing, but there are other areas that come beyond it. There are also more risks from more areas coming into bribery and corruption. Another Australian example that came up recently was Malaysian government officials artificially hiking the price of real estate. In this case, it was actually a university hall of residence or a dorm room for a university campus in Melbourne, where they massively inflated the price as a way of coming in and, shall we say, moving money between sources more effectively. So we're now seeing that kind of model, it's sometimes referred to as the Vancouver model, of inward investment in property and real estate as a way of moving money around, is becoming a lot more prevalent and at times a lot more worrying. The bribes themselves do continue, however. Keppel, an offshore drilling agency, were recently fined $422 million. There have been many bigger ones around there that are still going. But we're also seeing some other slight problems, such as the GlaxoSmithKline case that came around some time ago now, but it's highly relevant in that an individual was in trouble as a result of this. As a part of GlaxoSmithKline's compliance process and due diligence process, they illegally obtained information. And as a result of that illegal obtaining of information, one of the individuals involved in obtaining the information was sent to jail in China without charge for quite a long period of time. So as well as the reputational impact and the problems that come with that, an individual was sent to jail as well, which can have a real big knock-on effect. We see, however, that beyond just the financial penalties, I've touched on some of the issues that can impact a business earlier on, but the financial penalties are one thing. There are much more stronger penalties for getting it wrong above and beyond a company being fined hundreds of millions of dollars. It may sound flippant to say so, but many companies, $300 million, it's a drop in the ocean. It's not a big deal. If you are an employee of that company, however, that may have a really big impact on you. So the impacts that can come on board will be the reputational issue. The GlaxoSmithKline case I mentioned earlier, they had a very strong impact, a negative impact on their business reputation, which makes it very, very hard to get back into a head of steam for your business. There can also be a huge knock-on impact in your market value, share price, depending on the business. The perhaps most famous FCPA case to date has always been Siemens, who were hit with a very large fine some years ago. But as a result of that fine, they saw their share price halved. 50% was wiped off their share price in a period of about 5 or 6 months. So a huge drop-off in their value, and that made life very difficult. As we saw previously with the Odebrecht case in Mexico, can actually lead to exclusion or bans or an inability to enter into new market opportunities or into new countries or into new industry sectors. And it can also have a real damaging effect on ongoing long-term client relationships, whereby you may have a very trusted and good relationship with a client. If they see that you have been involved in a bribery or corruption scandal, that might really hurt their view of you and might have a detrimental impact on that relationship. One factor we found through research and through looking into the market and looking into the problems created by bribery and corruption, however, is it's not just that, it's the individuals. There's a real impact on talent, on your employee base, on your human resources issues, both from retaining existing staff. There's quite a lot of evidence that in a bribery and corruption scandal situation, a lot of senior staff and junior staff will seek to move on because they don't want to be seen to be associated with a corrupt company. That, of course, has a knock-on impact onto your productivity. If you lose staff, you lose productivity, you slow your momentum as a business. So obviously at that point, you're trying to hire new talent. If that's high-level talent, if it's even low-level people, it doesn't matter where they are, you're faced with that challenge of bringing new people on board. Within that challenge, you have the problem that the first thing those potential new people are going to do is look at your reputation online. And if the first thing they see when they fire up the search engine is that your company is corrupt, they'll go and look somewhere else. So it can have a massive problem about hiring employees. We've even actually seen some research and some reporting, notably from a company called CH2M Hill, who are also in the construction sector. And they said that they actually found that their industry's reputation, not their reputation, but the reputation of their industry was making it harder for them to attract new talent into the business. So there can be a knock-on effect not only on you, but on your business as well. On top of that, there's the issue of the ongoing supervision and monitorship costs, which can really draw out. Siemens are continuing to spend money on that, even after 10 plus years since their fine. They're continuing to have to spend a large amount of money. Walmart, which is another case that's rumbling through at the moment, that some of the legal costs involved with this and some of the actual the costs around the case beyond any fines are frankly staggering, and those will have a big impact. As I touched on in the first slide, that issue of personal liability, that issue of individuals being sent to jail, no amount of financial penalty is as scary as sending an executive to jail. So if a company sees a $300 million fine, they can probably soak that up. If the chief compliance officer is taken away in handcuffs, that's a much, much more pressing problem. From that, I wanted to take some time to look at a little bit of the international landscape and look at some of the earlier regulation and some of the newer regulation and see how and where things are difficult, but also how and where things match up. There's a vast amount of text on this slide, and I don't intend to read through all of it, but almost all bribery and corruption regulation can trace itself back in some way to either crime or fraud laws in countries, or in many cases through to the FCPA. The FCPA is, in some cases, quite a narrow piece of regulation in that it outlaws the bribery of foreign public officials. So it's not necessarily looking at all bribery or all corruption, it's looking at a particular flavour of bribery and corruption. And in that respect, it's a very strong piece of regulation. It's very powerful. It has huge impact in the global marketplace beyond the US. I've recently just returned from speaking in Australia, where the FCPA remains a very pressing concern for Australian businesses. So even on the other side of the world, the FCPA still has that impact. But as I say, it's not the broadest of regulations. And one of the trends that we see in terms of how enforcement grows and develops is that each new piece of regulation that comes along will look at what's gone before, learn from that, and in many cases add something. So make it stronger, make it more powerful, make it a more effective piece of regulation by learning from, I suppose one could say, the mistakes or potentially the omissions of older regulations. You're able to make something more powerful. So along comes the UK Bribery Act, which makes things, in some cases, easier in that it just outlaws bribery. It says, don't pay a bribe, don't receive a bribe. That's a lot easier to define. It also prosecutes both sides of the offence rather than just one side, which in some cases can be seen as levelling the playing field more effectively. It makes no distinction between a foreign public official and a private entity. So again, that's very much about making things easier to understand, easier to regulate, and easier to potentially to enforce, because there's no blurred line, there are no grey lines in there. And it brought in a very strong piece of law in the UK, which is the failure to prevent. And that's a predicate offence under the UK Bribery Act, that if you as a business, and potentially as an individual, fail to prevent bribery, you have committed a criminal offence. And this is a really good way of making compliance as a process and as a practice mandatory. It means that you really do have to do something. You can't just sit back and say, oh, well, we'll sort out a compliance problem after the fact. There's been one relatively recent case of an interior decorating company in the UK who were fined under the UK Bribery Act, and they actually brought in their compliance program after they were identified and after the investigation began into their conduct. So in that case, there's a lovely old British expression of bolting the stable door after the horse has gone. In that case, the horse had really gone. and they brought in the compliance process far too late. After the fact, they were charged with failure to prevent bribery. In France, relatively recently, we've seen the implementation of a new law, Sapin 2, which is the second round of their anti-bribery and corruption regulation, brought in by an individual whose surname is Sapin, in case anyone wonder where the name comes from. In many ways, it's very similar to the UK Bribery Act. It doesn't have too many big differences. It does primarily or almost exclusively apply to French companies, which is perhaps a slightly narrow-minded view on it, but it has one piece of law, which is, well, it has two pieces of law, which are much stronger than anything that's gone before. One of those is it is absolutely mandatory to have a policy and procedure for your anti-bribery and corruption process in place. So any company that falls under Sapin 2 must have policy, procedure in place, fully documented and available. That's a good thing. If you don't have that policy, much like the failure to prevent law, you are liable. But it also has perhaps my favorite piece of recent anti-bribery and corruption regulation. It has an agency, the Agence Française Anticorruption, the French anti-corruption agency, and they have the right and responsibility to proactively and aggressively audit those policies and processes. Previously, anti-bribery and corruption has been very much a reactionary piece of law globally, in that it has been after the fact. So once an incident has been identified, investigations begin. In the case of Sapin 2, they have the ability to go and review the policy, review the procedures, and prosecute if those procedures are not good enough. Not if there's been a bribe paid or if there's been a corruption scandal within a business. There doesn't have to be any of that. It's purely on the process and the policy. And that's a really good way of even further tightening up those issues. Australia, as I mentioned recently, they're probably the next on the line in terms of what they're doing and what they're changing. And the key thing that they're changing is that they're really trying to align much more globally so that there's a better global standard across the board. There are a few changes they're going to bring which may pose some problems for resources in conducting due diligence, one of which is they're expanding their definition of a foreign public official to include candidates for office. So under the new proposed changes, anyone standing for political office or standing for election will be a foreign public official. Now, in the UK, where I'm based, we have a long and very proud tradition of joke candidates, shall we say, not serious candidates. Notably, recently, we had an individual called Lord Buckethead who stood for election in our last general election. I highly recommend looking him up. He's quite the character. Australia themselves had a party called the Deadly Serious Party, who one of their policies was to arm penguins against potential invasion. So it does create a problem of building a huge amount of noise out of potential individuals who this law will see as a foreign public official, but who aren't really a foreign public official because they don't wield any power or influence. So that could have an issue. But overall, the trend of these laws is to bring in much more of a level playing field, much more harmonization of these laws. And this leads to one of the strongest trends that we're seeing in enforcement of anti-bribery and corruption, that across borders, we're now seeing multiple jurisdictions in bringing enforcement actions on the same case. Whereas previously we'd see the SCPA riding in and I suppose stealing the thunder, bringing the prosecution, the high dollar numbers out there. We're now seeing more often prosecutions from multiple jurisdictions. One of the most notable of these was the Rolls-Royce case relatively recently, which involved prosecutors from the UK, the US and other countries. And there may even still be some more to follow on that. We're seeing a lot more of that as part of the new normal, I suppose we could say. Beyond the pure anti-bribery and corruption issues, however, there's a vast tide and there's a growing pressure for companies to comply with many other regulations. Obviously, there's a local equivalent of anti-bribery and corruption law, the Chinese Criminal Code, the German Criminal Code. There are other, wherever you operate, you may find yourself brought under the local criminal code as well as the international one. A very good example would be Sapin 2. A French company will be absolutely mandated to comply with Sapin 2, but if they trade in or through the UK, they will also have to comply with the UK Bribery Act. If they also traded in China, they'll have to comply with the Chinese laws as well. So that can create a real a morass, a growing amount of information that you have to soak up to try and balance. There's then a really increasing trend of human trafficking and what is, I put modern slavery in parentheses, and I have to admit this is a personal issue for me. I find the term modern slavery completely and utterly wrong. There's nothing modern about it. It is just slavery. So when the UK brought out the Modern Slavery Act, I did slightly sigh and feel bad that they'd done that. It's just slavery. But we are seeing with the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act, with the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, we are seeing now that there's a drive to make disclosure of your efforts to stamp out human trafficking, slavery, child exploitation. That is beginning to be seen as a big thing. Within that, it's highly likely, and it certainly feels and seems from talking to prosecutory agencies, from talking to people around the world, that this may well be the next point of real regulation. So to date, a lot of it has been about disclosure, simply saying, we have a policy to stamp out slavery in our supply chain. But I think we may move from that, beyond that, into actual beyond just disclosure, into actual action. What are you actually doing to stop that? There's then a renewed focus on the sanctions world. Sanctions are a particularly hot topic at the moment over the last week or two. There was a recent probe on Huawei, a Chinese mobile phone, cell phone manufacturer who've been trading goods in and through Iran. But in recent days, we've also seen a shift in the policy towards Iran from the US, and we're likely to see more sanctions brought in. Now, rather confusingly for businesses, it appears that rather than those sanctions being brought in at a hard date, so as of midnight on the 17th of May, the following companies will be sanctioned or following individuals will be sanctioned. Latest reports seem to say that it's going to take between 90 and 180 days to bring those sanctions in. Now that creates a real problem for businesses who are having to monitor their relationships, their third parties. They might currently be totally legitimately doing business with an entity linked to Iran who is not sanctioned, but at some point between 90 and 180 days' time, that business may stop being regulated or may stop being legitimate and may become sanctioned. That's creating a problem of confusion. There's then the issue of conflict minerals, particularly prevalent in the high-tech manufacturing sector, again, tied into protection of both human rights and the law of humanitarian actions. That's having a big impact. It's primarily around disclosure, much like the human trafficking and slavery regulations, but could see more. And one thing we are increasingly seeing is a real appetite. I think this is the positive part of the piece. There's a definite appetite for companies to involve their corporate social responsibility due diligence with their compliance process. That's all about protecting that reputation that you built up, but also helping to build more value in your brand. So it's one of the more positive things that's coming into the space. With all of these regimes, all of these things that have to be complied with, there are points of common ground, and I think this is where some of the efficiencies can be made and some of the effectiveness can be brought into a process. And that common ground all starts from one thing, which is risk assessment. The foundation stone of absolutely any of the compliance regimes that I've just touched on is carrying out a risk assessment. If your risk assessment establishes that you do not do business with the UK or trade through the UK at all, have no UK employees, and have no business through UK-located servers or carry out transactions in sterling, then you can dismiss the UK Bribery Act from your compliance process. It's a highly unlikely scenario, but a risk assessment will allow you to really focus on what you need to be looking at. Across all regimes, again, the need to document or implement a program and have that in place. Sapin 2 in France makes a very strong case to make sure you actually do that physically. The UK Bribery Act's failure to prevent regime or law rather does the same, makes it much stronger. Sitting in any process, be that from a sanctions regime, an anti-bribery and corruption regime, even down to your human trafficking concerns, due diligence is an absolute part. The due diligence is obviously built on your risk assessment and should be proportional to that, but due diligence must be a baseline of any compliance program. So again, much like the risk assessment, it is an absolute foundation. In many cases, the due diligence can also form a part of the risk assessment, but the two cannot exist in isolation. The issue of ongoing monitoring is increasingly important, particularly among the corporate sector and also the financial sector. We're seeing a lot more talk of just accepting what's gone before, carrying out due diligence, accepting those results, and not doing anything else with it. There's definite need to make sure that whatever you do is ongoing monitoring. Due diligence is never just a one and done process. It must be ongoing. There's the issue of actually making sure you're reporting and either a SAR, suspicious activity report, or a suspicious matter report, or if you identify something through a whistleblower program, reporting that case. All of this needs to lead back up the tree through your risk assessment, through the documentation of that program, to make sure you're reporting appropriately and reporting to the right places. But these pieces apply to every single part of a compliance program. And as well as the ongoing monitoring of your due diligence, the whole process needs to be an ongoing process. It was a little hard to try and squeeze it all into a slide, but almost when you reach monitoring and review, you almost go back to risk assessment and start again. And you can never just let that lie, let it stop. Because the risks change, the processes change, and there's a real need to actually do that. Within the due diligence phase, when you're carrying out due diligence into third parties for any of those regimes before, there's again really strong common ground. So if we took the anti-money laundering world as a starting point, looking at the list of those attending, I noticed that many of you are from the financial sector, so this is not unheard of for you, but sanctions have to form a foundation of any due diligence program. They're quite a binary process. They're in there. There's then the need to look at politically exposed persons, to look at their network of business, of their relatives and associates and known business associates, and also best practice to really look at adverse media results to find out if there's any indication of bad behavioural patterns for an individual or a company. So it's fairly straightforward. That sounds flippantly straightforward, but fairly straightforward piece to be looking at. If you then try and build in or layer in an anti-bribery and corruption compliance-led due diligence, because of the strong focus on the FCPA for foreign public official, you then need to be looking at a state-owned or state-controlled company. So are you dealing with a PEP, a government official? Are you dealing with a state-owned entity? A state-owned entity falls under the instrumentality of state piece. And also look for the management or the senior executives of that state-owned entity. Because although they may not be a PEP under the traditional anti-money laundering rules or regulations, they may actually become a position of responsibility and instrumentality of state, and therefore under the FCPA, you should be looking at those for foreign public official. But the rest of the process, it's really just layering in new pieces of information that you need to look at. And your risk-based approach and your risk assessment should identify that to build in an ABC process, you layer in more. On top of that, if you then wanted to layer in a more not risk-averse, but a risk and reputation-based due diligence process, you build in the same categories of research that you're looking for, the same pieces of information. But then you might want to look at more supplier risk or corporate social responsibility topics. Now, those topics might be through an adverse media research. You might be looking to see if your suppliers have been involved in human trafficking. Keep coming back to that word, but that seems to be the hot topic. Or we might be looking to see if there's any even positive news or positive output you can find, or connections or business relationships. So the common ground within these pieces is that it's just layering in different pieces of information to your due diligence program to try and maximize the efficiency of doing it. This, of course, means that in some cases you can do one piece of due diligence for multiple purposes, rather than having it siloed into individual locations or individual places. So as I touched on, there are certain common ground pieces to all compliance regimes. Obviously, the training, communication, and commitment to that top tone from the top piece that's so often talked about is essential. But the due diligence phase, based on your risk-based approach, based on a risk assessment, is common to absolutely all compliance processes. Because of the diversity of regimes and the diversity of issues that a compliance program is faced with, some kind of baseline global standard is essential. You need to be doing some form of due diligence on all relationships at a baseline level. You can then tailor that depending on your local obligations. So again, the difference between the FCPA and the UK Bribery Act, if it was just an FCPA concern, you're really trying to focus on whether you're doing business with foreign public officials. If you're looking at it from a UK Bribery Act concern as well, there is the need to look at foreign public officials, but you're also looking beyond that into more reputational, behavioural issues to see if there are any other patterns or any other issues you can identify. All of this rolls down to some of the big pressures that compliance functions are faced with. I recently heard someone describe their compliance program or their compliance department as the Department of No. And that was the perception that their business had. Can we engage a new third party? No. Can we do business in this country? No. And that was the perception that the business had of compliance. And that's a shame, because compliance can actually be a very positive force within a business. At the moment, some of the key pressures that are falling onto a compliance function, however, are an increasing volume of third parties, both upstream and downstream in the supply chain, and increasing reliance on those third parties. The increasing global nature of business is also having an impact. There's a large amount of money flowing, and invariably it's flowing from more risky locations, shall we say. The example I gave earlier from Malaysian officials investing in property in Melbourne is quite a solid one of this. There's also, as I mentioned, the Vancouver model of inward investment into Vancouver from non-British Columbians, and using it as a way of laundering and moving money. So that influx and mobility of investment is creating problems for compliance as well. There's then two, I suppose, perception issues that come in. I already touched on the no, Department of No being a barrier to business, but it's also often the case that compliance is seen as a cost center. It's seen as something that doesn't really help the business. It's just a labor-consuming, a time-consuming process that gets in the way. And those are things that I think there are ways we can help as a compliance profession, if we will, to change that, and hopefully those things will begin to improve. If compliance can focus on the core efforts within an anti-bribery and corruption process, it's very easy to take those core efforts and make them into something much more effective and much stronger. One of the traditional problems of that Department of No policy, or the due diligence process within the compliance world, has been things being tucked into silos, things being put away and done, and actually about the due diligence process being a binary yes or no approach. Can we do business with this entity? Yes. Can we not do business with this entity? Just quite binary. The result comes back, go ahead, don't go ahead. This creates a problem, and I think there's a real potential for compliance to become a positive within a business. I'm duty-bound to include at least one Latin quotation in every presentation I do, just to thank my parents for my education. But the idea that knowledge is power, scientia potentia est. It's a very old quote, originally I think from a 10th century Muslim scholar, that just says, if you have knowledge, you have power. And we're seeing and hearing a lot more companies talking about their due diligence process and their compliance process as knowledge. Not necessarily as the Department of No, not necessarily as a binary yes or no answer, but gathering information and gathering knowledge about your third-party relationships that you can use to improve those relationships. I've seen one mining company who make a very strong point of sharing all their due diligence process with the business, the frontline business people. And they do that because that information can help develop a stronger relationship with the supplier, but can also very much help with such simple things as pricing negotiations. They're able to actually use their due diligence process to empower their businesses to negotiate more effectively. And that's a real benefit. So rather than that information just being siloed away, it's a real benefit to be able to share that information and empower your business with it. By looking at process efficiencies and looking at ways that one due diligence program can answer multiple regimes, for example, companies are able to, and compliance teams are able to say, we can actually do more with less. We can automate our processes. We can bring things in line. We can just tailor what we're looking for within a due diligence process to reflect on different regimes, but within one process. By doing that, you can not only help with that information, that power, the knowledge is power piece, but you can also very much help with the cutting down of workload and cutting down of multiple silos doing very similar things. So instead of having one team doing pure ABC due diligence, one team looking at your sanctions regime, one team looking at your supply chain risk, there is an opportunity to move much of that into one centralized, more efficient process. The other main reason compliance is a huge benefit for a business is it's a preventative, it's an insurance policy. Compliance helps protect the reputation of the business. So again, rather than just being the department of no, compliance can really help protect and ensure that you as a business are not getting into the wrong places or doing the wrong business. And this rather leads me on to me getting a little bit on my soapbox. I live in the countryside in a small village, and I recently moved house, which meant moving pub. Now, for anyone who knows the United Kingdom, we have our local pubs, and local pubs are perhaps more important than our houses. And when you move pub, you move and you meet new people. I met someone who I didn't know, a friend of a friend, and conversation got round to, well, what do you do? And I thought, how on earth do I describe what I do? I started talking about I work in the field of anti-bribery and corruption. And he said, well, what does that mean? I said, well, I work in an area where we help companies avoid bribery and corruption. We help companies comply with regulations and engage in better business. And he said, well, what does that mean? And I suddenly realized that there wasn't enough of us in the compliance world talking about why it really matters. I started the presentation talking about the fines, the jail sentences, and all of those issues. And those are absolutely valid. Those issues are valid. But I wanted to try and humanize it and bring in something which really shows what it actually means. And that begins with an individual. The individual in question here is Teodoro Obiang. Teodoro Obiang is the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea. And for some time, he was also the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry, or as he referred to himself, the Minister for Cutting Down Trees. Mr. Obiang, as an individual, was a government minister on a salary of around $99,000 US. Let's call it $100,000 US a year. So a reasonably well-paid individual. As part of his role in the forestry division, the Ministry of Forestry in Equatorial Guinea, he was responsible for selling the licenses to deforest effectively, to come and cut down trees in Equatorial Guinea. Obviously, while doing so, it appears he may have accepted some additional payments from companies looking to log and carry out forestry operations in Equatorial Guinea. When some of those issues came around and caught up with him, there were certain responses that came out of that. He received a 3-year jail sentence, a suspended jail sentence, I hate to say. He also was fined 30 million euros, a suspended fine, again, I hate to say. So he largely escaped. But one of the issues that he didn't escape with was an asset recovery program. There was a real draw to try and get some of the ill-gotten gains. So when the French authorities turned up at one of his flats in Paris, they started taking away his cars. They took away these cars. For anyone who knows cars, you may know what these are, but to give you an idea, the two on the bottom, I think, are the Bugatti Veyron. They're probably around $1.5–2 million US each. When they finished taking away those cars, they took away some more of his cars. Again, this is just one of his houses in Paris, on one of his Rolls Royces, one of his Maseratis on the back there, the white one, My own personal annoyance with this issue is the car on the front, which is an Aston Martin V600 Le Mans, and it's a car that I covet. And I'm very jealous that someone like him actually managed to own one of these. The asset recovery teams also looked at one of his yachts, seen here, the yacht called the Ebony Shine, as well as his entire property empire, including this house in Malibu with some film star neighbors. So this was an individual on $100,000 US a year who was quite clearly either a financial genius or issues were being taken away from him. Justice caught up with him, but unfortunately justice came a little bit late. And the question of why does it matter really comes down to what Equatorial Guinea actually is. And I pick on Equatorial Guinea as an example in the Obiangs because it shows the problem of bribery and corruption. Equatorial Guinea has, at the moment, the highest per capita income in Africa. It's a small country. Per capita income is the highest in Africa. And yet this image gives you an illustration of what everyday life is for the majority of people in Equatorial Guinea. 2/3 of the population live on less than $1 US per day. And in the most populated areas, so the towns and cities, only 41% of the population have access to clean drinking water. So that's in the populated areas. Life expectancy, infant mortality rates are all way below the average for sub-Saharan Africa. And on the UN Human Development Index, a global index of, I suppose, quality of life, they rank at 144 out of 187 countries ranked. So all of those issues with the highest per capita income doesn't help these people. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that carrying out bribery and corruption compliance will stop this from happening. It may not stop this from happening, but what it can do is it can make it a lot harder for businesses to engage in that way with a forestry minister, with a power minister, a utilities minister, whatever it may be. But hopefully it can also actually help divert money that would have gone to paying bribes or being corrupt into the resources that are needed in these countries. So in this case, it could have gone to actually making the school a little bit nicer for these guys here at school. It could have gone to developing infrastructure, clean water. It could have gone to healthcare to help people actually bring that infant mortality rate up a bit rather than being down at the bottom of the tree. It's a slightly emotive way of looking at it, but the hope is that carrying out compliance and ensuring that you as a business adhere to the growing tide of regulations, there is a real hope that we'll be able to actually level the playing field, make it harder for people to be corrupt, and therefore make it easier for companies to invest more ethically, more effectively, more profitably, ultimately, and help those in other countries. I think my favorite example of this was one of the big box retailers were looking to go into a country, and the government officials said, yes, of course you can come to our country. Please build your big box out-of-town retail outfit here. So they did. They then said to the government officials in question, could we please have electricity in our business? The government official said, yes, of course you can, but you'll have to pay me. Now, this company in question had a very good bribery and corruption policy, thankfully, which said we don't pay bribes, and they refused. They said, we will not pay a bribe. The government official said, pay me. The company said, we will not pay a bribe. And this went on for some time, until eventually the government official gave up and said, well, actually, the jobs that you're going to bring into the country, the economic investment of having you as a brand in our country is more important than my bribe. He gave up, plugged in the electricity, the store opened, and shortly after the store opened, the company actually said, to celebrate our first store opening in this country, we're going to donate a very large amount of money to children's educational charities in that country. So the money that would have gone to paying a bribe, they held out, they stuck to their guns, they didn't pay a bribe, but then they invested it. Now, I'd love to see every company being like that. Hopefully we can get there at some point. In summary, just to touch on a couple of things before I take some questions. This idea of international cross-crime enforcement is growing. The Obiang case looked at bribery, corruption, anti-money laundering regimes. In many cases, we're also looking at the flow of money from corruption into a money laundering scheme, into something such as the Vancouver model of property investment, that flow all ties in together. And we're increasingly seeing that there's cross-crime and cross-border enforcement of regulations. This unfortunately means that you can't have a compliance process that ticks every box, says all of these things are the same, but you can build something that will help. Within that, there's very definitely a drive that compliance can improve that business, both from the knowledge is power angle, that if you are able to more effectively share information internally, your process will be more efficient, but also you'll be able to foster better, stronger relationships with your businesses. That can really help. And then on top of that, there's very definitely the case that proper investment, trying to clamp down on bribery and corruption, will actually help target your investment, target your growth, and increase and improve your profitability as a business. So with that, I wanted to move on, if I could, to take a couple of questions. And I've seen we've had some coming through, which I'll endeavour to read out. The first of the questions that I saw was
Mr. Thomas, may I interrupt you just for a quick second?
Yes,
I did want to let everybody know a little bit more about how to ask a question, but also ask for people who'd like to contact us to tell them how to do that. Would that be all right?
Yeah, please do go.
Okay, great. Yes, we are about to begin the Q&A session, and before we do, please notice the Contact Us icon. Now, that's the green icon at the bottom of your screen. And if you would like to be contacted by a LexisNexis Risk Solutions consultant, please click on the survey and let us know. And now it is time for the Q&A session. If you'd like to ask a question, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. Type it into the question box that appears, it being your question, and then hit the submit button. And we will try to get to as many questions as we can in the time that we have left. Okay, thank you, Mr. Thomas. Take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. The first question is one that suddenly plays on my heartstrings within the industry, which is, please could you define SOE and MSOE? The compliance industry is one which loves an acronym. Acronyms flow around everywhere, and I've recently heard the term acronym soup used to describe this. Lots of different companies, lots of different organizations use slightly different variations of those. When we're talking about an SOE, it's the concept of a state-owned or controlled or influenced company. So it's a company or a body which is owned by a government. In some cases, that might be owned by the sovereign wealth fund of a government. So there are many sovereign wealth funds in the world. Singapore, for example, has Temasek as one of their sovereign wealth funds. That is a government fund that invests globally. It might be that the company is entirely owned by the government. So if you took India, for example, the Indian Railway is owned by the government. In the UK, we have the National Health Service, which is owned by the British government. It is a government entity. In some cases, it's small-scale investment. You may see a government owning 10% of a business, 20% of a business, and it's really down to a risk-based approach to decide how influential you feel a government needs to be before you consider it to be a state-influenced or state-controlled entity. The MSOE term is an extension of that, which is the individuals or the responsible individuals within a business. So the senior level management, the board, the country managers of a particular country. The reason for this is, under the FCPA, they could be classified as an instrumentality of state. If they work for a government body, a state-owned entity, they can be classified as an instrumentality of state. And this means that you need to tailor your policies and procedures in how you deal with them in the same way as you would with a standard politically exposed person. So I do hope that's answered that one. Please feel free to respond through the platform if that was something you wanted a bit more on. The second question is regarding the Australia regulation. Is the Australia regulation also applicable in the USA for failure to prevent, like the UK and UK Bribery Act? At the moment, the Australian regulation currently applies to Australian businesses. It doesn't have quite the same extraterritorial reach as the UK Bribery Act, or perhaps even more so the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. However, it is under review at the moment, so the regulation is changing They haven't totally decided what is going to go into the new regulation. Australia overall is a country to look at very much for what's coming in enforcement and regulation. They've recently brought in something called Tranche 2, which is the second round of anti-money laundering regulation, where they're actually bringing the law, accountancy and real estate professions under the same regulatory landscape as a financial services company. So they're doing a lot of things and they're changing. They've been under a huge amount of pressure recently, Australia that is, to tighten up and make things more effectively. So I think we'll see them learning from the mistakes of previous regulatory environments. But at the moment, it's primarily focused on carrying out business in Australia. Just looking at the time, I wanted to actually touch on another couple to see. And there's actually one question which almost covers two. So I'm going to try and paraphrase the two of these together, which was with an increasing burden on compliance firms, how effective has global compliance regulation been in actually stopping corruption or money laundering? And the other question was actually, is it ever going to stop bribery and corruption? It's a very difficult one to actually quantify this. Part of it is down to, I think it was the Donald Rumsfeld quote about known knowns and known unknowns. It's very hard to know what you've stopped because you can only really tell what you've caught. There has been a marked increase in the amount of enforcement of bribery and corruption recently. We are seeing more and more cases of fines or sentences being handed down. Does that necessarily mean that bribery and corruption is going to stop? I wish I could stand here today in front of you all, or virtually in front of you all, and say all of these enforcement regimes, all of these compliance regimes will stop bribery. Unfortunately, they won't. Bribery is almost human nature. What it will do is it will make it much, much harder for a company to illicitly pay an individual or a company for business to be carried out. And it will also make it much, much harder for that individual to move any ill-gotten gains they have. So I look at it almost as a net, as a fishing net. Again, if you look at Australia recently, their net was too wide, so pretty much anything could swim through. They weren't catching enough fish. Every piece of enforcement regulation or compliance that we can bring into bear, everyone that we can bring in will help tighten that net, will make the gaps in the net smaller, and will make it harder for things to swim through the net. And the hope there is we will catch more and do more. I'd love to be able to say we're going to stop it all. Back to my conversation in the pub, I rounded it off with, hopefully we make the world a slightly better place. And I think that's fairly true. It's quite difficult to know if it is actually quantifiably stopping that. At a business level, at an individual business level, it can actually be something you can monitor and track because you're able to make sure that you don't have any of those unknowns coming through. And that's an issue. I think, however, it is fair, and the follow-up question that came in, that is there a way that this can be not too burdensome? I think carrying out compliance and carrying out due diligence can be seen as a burden. It can also be hopefully translated into a bit of a benefit, as I tried to touch on, that if you're doing due diligence from an anti-bribery and corruption perspective, you could also make sure you're covering yourself for human trafficking regulation at the same time. So rather than having to do too many things, you can be more efficient within that process. It really does mean, however, and I think the crux of the question is, it does mean that it is a burden and it is something that has to be picked up, that it cannot be avoided. But there are ways of making it as efficient as possible, as effective as possible, and trying to reduce that workload at the same time. I just want to touch on one final question, if I can, and this is about the concept of cross-border enforcement, and what are the consequences and potential pitfalls within that. I think one of the biggest issues is actually the cost of a cross-border enforcement, and this isn't necessarily the cost of the fine. If we look at Rolls-Royce, they were hit with big fines, but it's actually the cost of handling the process around it. the fine is one thing, but you may find yourself, if you are involved in bribery that crosses many borders, and the Serious Fraud Office, the Department of Justice in the US, and I'm trying to remember, the Australian Federal Police get involved, and they're all involved in investigating. You'll actually have to manage 3 separate investigation processes. You'll also have to actually manage 3 separate audit processes linked to that. You may subsequently have to manage 3 separate monitorships or review processes after the fact. So the more countries get involved with a prosecution, the more likely you are to be in a situation of having to do more work to answer the problems. So obviously, the simple answer to this is don't do anything that will cause you to have an enforcement action, and crucially, don't do anything to cause you to have a cross-border enforcement action. But the increasing nature of cross-border enforcement is that you will have more remediation work, more investigation work, and also more reputational impact. So rather than that issue being just one country, and in some cases it can be seen that the FCPA is quite an insular piece of regulation, that it's a US regulation rather than global, and does the impact echo out? Do the waves of impact go out beyond other countries? If you are enforced by multiple regimes, you'll get the same level of reputational issue, bad press, across multiple regimes. So with that, I think unfortunately there are far more questions than I'd be able to answer, which is always a nice thing. We will see if we can get back to any of you individually, but my contact details are there if you want to approach me individually, and as Mary said, there is an option to have us contact you directly. With that, Mary, I'll hand back to you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas. Today's presentation and webinar recording will be distributed to all registrants in the next few days. And if you would like to be contacted by a LexisNexis Risk Solutions consultant, please click on the Contact Us icon and let us know. Thank you so much for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.